Welcome to the series. Here we'll be making an activity tracker. You might be like, what is an activity tracker? So, all of us plan our days in different ways, and we would like to track our activities. We'd like to track our goals. We'd like to track our aspirations, and this app will be an example for it. So, we should be able to write our requirements, we should be able to write our tasks and our titles, and this should alert us accordingly. This will be a web app which will also be made as a progressive web app, so a near Android app. So this app should alert us when the deadline is due or whenever the time is due. It should send us a mail, and it should pretty much record and track what we want to. And this data should be available to us when we want to look at it. So to do this, we'll be using TypeScript. We'll be using Express-TS instead of Express.js. Uh, this will be a good place for everyone to learn TypeScript because TypeScript is much like extremely amazing. Once you start using it, you'll not return to JavaScript. We'll be using something called Prisma. Prisma is the ORM. It allows us to connect to the Postgres SQL, and we'll be using Postgres for our database. And for most part of this series, I'll be using Docker. You don't need to know what Docker is or how it works. I'll be using it just to make sure we'll be able to connect to Postgres, and that's pretty much it. Let's now get started. So, hey everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Here we are with a new series where we'll be building an activity tracker. For most of you who are into the web dev world, this might be pretty obvious, but this application will allow us to track our activity, goals, and our aspirations, and it'll alert us. That's the idea behind the application. And we'll be using Express, Postgres, and TypeScript for this. I'll be using Prisma ORM, and let's get started. So let's go make a directory called activity tracker. Let's shift it to that directory. And I use yarn. I personally prefer yarn. If you use the npm, please feel free to use it. So let me go initialize a new package.json file. Activity tracker 1 and activity tracker application for all your aspirations and goals. I'll be adding the GitLab repository for this very soon. Probably MIT false. So let's add the node modules. I'll be adding Express framework, TypeScript, and the types for Express. So a lot of the experienced folks out there use something called a boilerplate, but for the sake of simplicity, I'll be creating all the files from scratch. And sometimes you might feel you need to do it a different way. So when that time comes, I'll tell what is required. Otherwise, for sake of simplicity, we'll not be using a boilerplate. For our Postgres instance, I'll be running it in Docker to make it uniform, and I'll be adding the Docker file to a repository. So you need not worry what Docker is. If you have Docker installed, you can use this, or you can connect to your Postgres instance. So let's open VS Code. Oh, okay, I forgot to add something called the TS node and node monitor. So let me add all of that too. So let this get over. And we need to add types for that as well. So types slash node. So these are all in commands which brings us the node modules. You may not necessarily understand them when you're doing it for the first time, but as you get experience, you will understand them much better. So now let's go back to VS Code. Let's add scripts to this. I'll probably add my scripts here. So start. I prefer using the keyword dev. So npx nodemon src index ts. Sorry, not ts. So all of our code will be going into this directory called src. which also is the short form for source. So let's add a simple index.ts file here. Index.ts. So to test this if it's working or not, we can just say console log hello world. We can test this. Oops. And we can just type yarn dev and it should work. There we go, it just works fine. Now we can create our Express app. So we'll first import this thing called Express. Obviously, if you have the Visual Studio Code extensions like I do, you will get all of these recommendations. I have the TypeScript extension. So import Express, request and response. So usually people do this in different ways. I prefer using let. Some people use const, so that's up to you. Let app equals to Express. This probably will throw an error because I need to import Express this way too. And now I can put app.listen. So a lot of this gets parameterized, but I'll talk about that later. For now, let's keep it simple. We'll be listening it on port 5000 and we'll send a message. The app is listening on port. So most people do it this way. So const port number equals 5000 and they bring the port right in here. So that is the way most people do it. So, and some cases where people get this from the environment variable itself. So if you don't understand all of these terms, it's fine. As we progress, you'll be able to understand. But this is a good way to start. And now if you say this, the whole thing reloads. The mistake I did do is here in this line. So I just went on to, call this print statement without using a function, which will obviously throw an error because it's a callback. So if I remove this, it should work perfectly. And I wrote this as a function. This is called an arrow function. It's an anonymous arrow function. So for people who are not into the ES world or the TS world, I recommend you learn how the TS world works. So it is assumed that you understand what arrow functions are. Here the app is listening on this port and I've configured it accordingly. Let's just add an endpoint. So let's just say app.get and this should basically give us a hello world. So let's assume request response and this wouldn't return anything to us. So it's a void function and rest.status 200 send message hello world. So now let me explain what all of this means. So what we're trying to do is we're telling Express to take these two parameters of the function, request and response. So every time when you make a HTTP request, you can access all the request headers here and you can set the the response headers here. So that is the idea of setting request and response. And the types for the same have been imported here. So a lot of the experienced people do something like this where they isolate the functionality and the types. So they'll do something like this: express, request, and response, and remove the import of types here to make the code clean, which I would also be doing from now. That's a good way to start. Oops, the export got deleted. Now it should look good. From Express. Now that should work. And now if we go to a browser and if we say come to this endpoint, it should say hello world. So why don't we test that out? So now here we are in a browser. So let's go to the endpoint and it says hello world. So our app is working completely fine. And this is how you make a simple endpoint in an Express app. So now let us go back and let us make some more endpoints. Let us understand how it works. And then we'll start with the database. So we are back here and I've added some more code here. And this might be looking a bit confusing. So let me explain this. So every HTTP request has a body, and if the body has something called name, okay, a disclaimer: get request should not have request bodies, but if it does, it's allowed, but it's not recommended. So are not recommended. But for the sake of simplicity, let's assume there is a request body, and if that has a name called Abhijit, we can send a message hello Abhijit. Otherwise, we can send a message hello world. So now let us go back to the website and view it. So here we are. I'm using this tool called Postman. I keep frequently using this. I know there is a cooler VS Code alternative, and I also know curl exists, but I prefer using Postman. If you know how to use URL, it's completely fine. And when I meant data, when I meant request body, I meant data like this. You can obviously set your request headers for authorization principles, which I'll be explaining later in another part. But data like this on a GET request is not very suitable. It's not a very intuitive way of doing things. So if I send this, it should say, hello, Abhijit. I forgot to explain something. There's something important called JSON. So we need to tell our Express app to allow or to understand that there will be requests which contain JSON body. So Express should allow JSON to be accepted. So that is why we write this line app.use JSON. And this allows us to parse JSON. JSON is a file format. It's also a type. So however you see it, it's a way to store data. And to parse it, we need to use this middleware of Express. So once we do that, now if we go back to Postman, we'll be able to accept hello Abhijit. So let's go. Let us send this request and let's see what we get. It says HTTP 200 OK. And here we go. It says hello Abhijit. Now here if I say Ganesh here, it's going to say hello world. And there we go. It works completely fine. So I've removed the request object body code. So that is pretty much it for the endpoint part. Now let us add something called Prisma. Prisma is an ORM. It's a TypeScript / JavaScript ORM that allows us to access SQL and MongoDB data. And I'll link Prisma IO's website down. It's a very cool ORM which allows you to access all of the database stuff through a single language. That's the purpose of an ORM. So to do that, we need to install Prisma. So let's go back to the terminal. So here we are back in the terminal. So let's go add Prisma. Types for Prisma. Oops. So let's go initialize a Prisma project. Prisma init. And now let's go back to the VS Code. So Prisma DB supports all of these databases and it includes Mongo. You can refer to this link. And here we are back again. Now here if you see there is something called Prisma folder which has something called schema.prisma and we have a .env file. So this .env file is used for connecting to the database. Prisma does this for us and we can add our database schema here. So that is pretty much it for this video. In the next video, we'll be learning how to create a model in Prisma. We'll be learning how to make a post, a put, and a delete endpoint. And we'll also be learning how to connect to Docker or how to use Docker for our Postgres instance. So stay tuned, like, share, and subscribe. I hope you like this video, possibly share it with all of your friends, subscribe to this channel, and stay alert for the upcoming videos.